Today, we delve into the gripping history of the French and Indian War, a tumultuous conflict that unfolded from 1754 to 1763. This period was marked by alliances between the French and various Native American tribes, including the Delawares and Shawnees. These tribes launched fierce attacks against English colonists inhabiting the western frontier near the Allegheny Mountains. In this episode, we will recount the harrowing tale of the Bard family, who were taken captive by Delaware Indians in 1758. Our source is the historical account Incidents of Border Life by Joseph Pritz, published in 1838. This remarkable book chronicles the many instances of Indian attacks and the experiences of captives during the colonial era and around the time of the American Revolution. Richard Bard, an attorney, is the central figure of our story, which was penned by his son after Richard's death, drawing from the papers he left behind that documented his family's ordeal. Interestingly, while Richard's son was not among the captives, both of his parents faced dire circumstances. The account is titled An Account of the Captivity of Richard Bard Esquire, late of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, with his wife, family, and others, collected from his papers by his son, Archibald Bard. Although the title mentions only his father, the narrative reveals that Richard's wife endured far more severe treatment in captivity than he did. On the morning of April 13, 1758, Richard Bard was living in York County, now known as Adams, where he owned a mill that is currently referred to as Marshall's Mill, located in Carroll's Tract. It was on this fateful morning that a group of 19 Indians besieged his home, a scene discovered by a young girl named Hannah McBride, who, upon spotting the attackers, screamed and rushed inside. Inside the house were Richard, his wife, Lieutenant Thomas Potter, who was a cousin of General Potter, along with their infant child and a bound boy. As the Indians stormed in, one brandished a large cutlass and struck Lieutenant Potter. Remarkably, Potter managed to wrest the sword from the Indian, returning the blow that, had it not hit the ceiling, would have ended his life. In the chaos, Richard attempted to defend himself with a horseman's pistol, but it failed to fire, causing one of the attackers to flee. Despite their efforts to barricade the door, the situation grew increasingly desperate. With no ammunition left and realizing that the Indians might set the house ablaze, the Bards decided to surrender. Meanwhile, the attackers took other prisoners, including Samuel Hunter and Daniel McManamy, and a young lad named William White, who was passing by the mill. After securing their captives and looting the house, the Indians set fire to the mill. As they journeyed further into the mountains, Richard's mother inquired about her captors, who revealed they were from the Delaware Nation. However, their promises of safety quickly fell apart. A short distance from the Bard home, they brutally killed Thomas Potter. Tragically, a few miles later, one of the Indians turned his weapon on Richard's small child, delivering a fatal blow before scalping the innocent victim. As the group continued, they fired upon Mr. Halbert, who was spotted outside, but miraculously, he escaped unharmed. They then set up camp for the night near McCord's old fort. The following day, while traversing the Path Valley, they spotted a group of white men in pursuit. Fearing capture, the captors urged their prisoners to hurry, threatening death if they were overtaken. After a grueling trek, they reached the top of Tusker Aurora Mountain and paused to rest. However, in a shocking act of violence, an Indian suddenly struck Samuel Hunter, sitting beside Richard, with a tomahawk, killing him instantly and scalping him before continuing their journey. On the fifth day, while crossing Stony Creek, the wind blew Richard's hat off. When the Indian guarding him went to retrieve it, Richard saw an opportunity and attempted to escape. However, upon his return, the captor mercilessly beat Richard with a gun, leaving him severely injured and barely able to walk. Realizing his dire situation, Richard resolved to escape that night. Earlier, half of his head had been painted red, a sign that a council had determined his fate. Half wished for his death, while the other half wished to spare him. Another council was imminent. That night, as fate would have it, Richard and his wife were finally allowed to speak and assist each other while plucking a turkey. It was during this quiet moment that Richard shared his plan to escape with his mother. After a few Indians had settled down, and one was amusing himself, by wearing his mother's gown, Richard seized his chance. He filled a quart container with water from a nearby spring, stepping away under the pretense of fetching more water. As he made his escape, the Indians, distracted by their merriment, failed to notice until it was too late. Despite 2 days of searching for him, the Indians eventually abandoned their pursuit and continued down the stream to the Allegheny River, eventually arriving at Fort Duquesne, known today as Fort Pitt. After a brief stay, they proceeded further down the Ohio River to an Indian town. Upon entering, Richard's mother suffered a brutal beating at the hands of a squaw who ripped her cap from her head. Exhausted and pleading to stay, she was met with the cruel response that she could remain if she preferred scalping over continuing on. Eventually, they took her to a town called Kosciuszko, where she and other captives faced unspeakable treatment. The tragic fate of Daniel McManamy unfolded just outside Kosciuszko. Here, I will share details from Richard Bard's papers that recount the harrowing circumstances surrounding McManamy's death, as recounted by Richard's mother shortly after her return. The Indians encircled the captive, beginning their brutal assault with sticks and tomahawks. Tied to a post near a roaring fire, he endured horrific tortures, subjected to the searing pain of burning coals pressed against his skin. The torment escalated as they scalped him, holding the bloody trophy aloft on a pole before his horrified eyes. In a cruel display, a gun barrel was heated until it glowed red and then pressed against his body, followed by the piercing agony of a red-hot bayonet stabbing repeatedly into his flesh. Their chants and jeers filled the air as they continued this relentless torture until he finally succumbed to his injuries. In the aftermath of such horror, my mother was compelled to leave that place, departing without her 2 sons and daughter, whom she would not see again until their eventual liberation. Overwhelmed by despair and uncertainty, she ventured forth alone, stripped of comfort and companionship, haunted by the fear of meeting the same fate as McManamy in the next town she encountered. In her anguish, she came across a group of Indians, among them a fellow captive woman. To this woman, my mother confided her fears, seeking solace. The woman reassured her, explaining that the belt of wampum around my mother's neck was a clear sign of her intended adoption into their tribe, a sign that her life was not in immediate danger. As they continued their journey, they soon arrived at a town where my mother was led into the council house. Inside, 2 squaws approached her. One struck her on the side of the head, and as the second was about to follow suit, my mother instinctively turned her head, receiving a second blow. The warriors present were visibly displeased, as such violence in a council house was against their customs. At that moment, a chief took my mother by the hands and formally presented her to 2 Indian men, declaring her to take the place of a deceased sister. She was placed under the care of a squaw, tasked with ensuring she was properly clothed and cared for. My mother remained with her adopted family for nearly a month, when the group began to plan a move to the headwaters of the Susquehanna River, a daunting journey of about 200 miles. This news weighed heavily on her heart, having already traversed over 200 miles through mountains and swamps, which had left her feet and legs swollen and sore. Fortunately, on the day they set out, her adopted brother gifted her a horse. However, not long into their journey, one of the horses in the group collapsed and died, forcing her to relinquish her mount to replace it. As they continued, they encountered several Indians, one of whom offered her words of encouragement, assuring her that peace was on the horizon and she would soon have the opportunity to return home. This promise was particularly comforting, as it came from a chief counselor in the Delaware Nation, with whom she was held captive. Upon nearing the end of her arduous journey, she was shocked to come across the body of a fellow captive lying dead by the roadside, tomahawked and scalped. She learned that this unfortunate soul had attempted to escape but was overtaken at this very spot. Finally arriving at her destination after nearly 500 miles of travel, my mother was struck by fatigue, compounded by exposure to the cold and hunger. These hardships culminated in a severe illness that lasted nearly 2 months. In her desolation, she found herself with no one to comfort or sympathize with her. Her only covering a tattered blanket and her bed the cold, hard earth of a miserable cabin. Boiled corn constituted her sole sustenance, and she grew so weak that she feared she was nearing death. Fortunately, after enduring this sickness, she encountered a familiar woman, also a captive. This woman had been in captivity for several years and had an Indian husband with whom she had a child. My mother chided her for her situation, but the woman replied that before her consent, she had been tied to a stake, prepared for burning. She explained that as soon as captive women learned the Indian language, they were forced to marry or face execution. This revelation solidified my mother's resolve never to learn the language, a promise she upheld throughout her captivity, lasting 2 years and 5 months. Despite her circumstances, she was treated with considerable kindness by her adopted family, more than she could have anticipated. Now, let us return to the story of my father, Richard, following his daring escape from the Indians. As soon as they realized he was missing, they gave chase. In a desperate bid for survival, he concealed himself in a hollow log, waiting until the sound of pursuit faded before cautiously resuming his flight in another direction. For 2 relentless days, the Indians scoured the wilderness in search of him. Meanwhile, Richard endured tremendous fatigue and suffering as he traversed a daunting mountain for miles wide, its peak blanketed in snow. Exhausted from nearly constant travel over 2 days and nights, he had gone without proper nourishment, surviving only on a few buds he managed to pluck from trees along his path. His shoes were in tatters, and the rugged terrain, fraught with briars of a poisonous nature, inflicted painful lacerations on his already swollen feet. Adding to his plight, the mountain was heavily overgrown with laurel, the snow clinging to its leaves and bending them down, obstructing his path. In his weakened state, he often had to crawl on his hands and knees beneath the low-hanging branches to make any progress. Now, 3 days had passed since his daring escape. Fear gnawed at him, the fear that the Indians might still be hot on his trail, tracking him through the snow to his hiding place. Yet, despite his anxiety, he found himself unable to continue. His body was too weak and battered. His hands, raw and swollen from crawling through the snow, mirrored the agony in his feet. Compelled to rest, he lay still, with little hope of advancing any further on his journey. The dangers of being recaptured by his savage pursuers loomed large. And to make matters worse, he was starving, having tasted nothing but the occasional buds from the beanwood or redbud tree since his escape. On the 5th day of his grueling ordeal, Richard, still crawling on his hands and knees and unable to walk, searched desperately for any buds or herbs to quell his gnawing hunger. Fortune smiled upon him when he spotted a rattlesnake, which he swiftly killed and consumed raw. After lying low for 3 or 4 days, he managed to alleviate the swelling in his feet by carefully puncturing the festering wounds with a thorn. In a moment of determination, he tore his breeches into strips and fashioned makeshift bandages for his battered feet. With this newfound resolve, he set out once again on his journey, each step accompanied by excruciating pain. The alternative was unthinkable: to remain where he was and succumb to the elements. He had only traveled a short distance when, having just ascended a hill, he was startled by the faint but unmistakable sound of a drum. Desperately, he called out, hoping for a response, but the only answer was the silence of the wilderness, a cruel trick of his imagination. Saddened and disheartened, he pressed on. On the 8th day, he crossed the Juniata River, wading through the frigid water with immense difficulty due to his injuries. As night fell, the cold intensified, and Richard's clothes, now wet from the river, left him feeling numb and vulnerable. Fearing that lying down would lead to his demise, he resolved to continue his journey, despite the darkness and fatigue weighing heavily on him. Providentially, as he stumbled through the night, he spotted the flickering remnants of a fire, likely left behind by settlers who had been pursuing the Indians. He stayed by the fire until morning, and when dawn broke, he discovered a path that led toward the settlements. He followed it with whatever speed he could muster, having survived the past 9 days on little more than a few buds and the flesh of 4 snakes. That afternoon, As he turned a corner on his path, he was startled to come face to face with 3 Indians. His heart raced at the thought of imminent death, but to his surprise, they proved to be friendly. Rather than ending his life, they guided him safely to Fort Littleton in Bedford County, a familiar refuge where he would rest and recover his strength for a few days. After returning home, Richard ventured to Fort Pitt, which was then under English control. He learned that several Indians were on the opposite side of the river, gathering to form a treaty. One evening, he crossed over to inquire about his mother. Among the gathered Indians, he recognized several who had been present when he was taken prisoner. He revealed himself, but they feigned ignorance. Undeterred, he asked if they remembered the time and place of the capture of 9 individuals. They acknowledged the event and began to question him about his return home. However, when he pressed for information about his mother, they claimed ignorance but promised to provide details by the following day. After this encounter, Richard returned to the fort. Shortly thereafter, a young man, taken by the Indians as a child, approached him with a warning. He advised Richard not to return, revealing that he had overheard the Indians express a strong desire to sink the tomahawk into his head, and that they had planned to kill him upon his return the next day. The young man implored Richard to keep their conversation secret, emphasizing the danger that lingered. With that, he returned to camp, aware of the peril that shadowed his every move from the moment my father was taken by the Indians until my mother's release. His life became a relentless quest for information about her. After learning her whereabouts, his mind was consumed with devising plans for her rescue. In pursuit of this goal, he aimed to return to Pittsburgh. Along the way, he encountered a brigade of wagons led by Mr. Irvine and traveled with them as far as Bedford. However, finding this method of travel too slow, he spoke to the commanding officer at Bedford, requesting that Captain White Eyes, who led a party of Indians, accompany him to Pittsburgh. This arrangement was made, and with a horse and a new rifle in hand, my father set out with the Indians. They had only traveled about 2 miles when one of the Indians veered off the road to collect a scalp, freshly taken from one of the wagoners that morning. This grim sight unnerved my father, but they continued on for another 10 miles. Suddenly, the Indians diverted again, returning with several stolen horses and a keg of whiskey they had hidden. Soon after, the atmosphere shifted as the Indians began to drink, becoming increasingly intoxicated. One of them, with wild eyes, indicated to my father that he intended to shoot him, raising his gun to aim. Thinking quickly, my father ducked behind a tree and circled around it, the Indian in hot pursuit. This absurd chase provided a moment of comic relief for the onlookers until a young Indian stepped in, twisting the gun from White Eye's hands and hiding it under a log. As the Indians grew more intoxicated, they scattered, leaving only White Eyes with my father. In a fit of rage, White Eyes struck him with a large stick, aiming for his head. My father instinctively raised his arm to shield himself, absorbing a blow that would leave it black and bruised for weeks. Just then, an Indian from another tribe, sent as an express to Bedford, happened upon the scene. Captain White Eyes asked this newcomer for his gun to finish my father off, but the Indian refused, explaining that killing my father would jeopardize the fragile peace they were trying to negotiate. They spoke in broken English, bound by the necessity of communication between their differing nations. Realizing his perilous situation, my father resolved to escape. He boldly told Captain White Eyes, "Our horses are getting away," and moved closer, expecting to feel the bullet pierce his back at any moment. Reaching his horse, he quickly mounted and took off down the road. It wasn't long before he spotted the Indian who had disarmed White Eyes, now sleeping by a spring. My father often recounted that had it been any other Indian, he would have taken the shot without hesitation. Fearing pursuit, he rode as fast as his horse could carry him, traveling through the night until he finally reached Pittsburgh just after sunrise. He had barely settled in when, to his alarm, he discovered that the Indians were already on his trail. Despite his anger at the Indians, my father suppressed his feelings, fearing for my mother's safety should he confront them. In a stroke of opportunity, he managed to write her a letter, requesting that her adopted friends bring her to him in exchange for a reward of 40 pounds. After waiting impatiently for a response, he grew frustrated and decided to negotiate with an Indian to kidnap her. However, on the eve of the planned operation, the Indian backed out, claiming he would be killed if he proceeded. Undeterred, my father resolved to undertake the perilous journey himself. He set out for a location on the Susquehanna, likely near what was known as Shamokin, not far from the prominent cherry trees. From there, he followed an Indian path until evening, when he encountered a party of Indians returning with my mother. The Indians passed him, raising their war whoop, causing my mother distress at their ominous demeanor. Sensing the tension, my father began promising them the payment he had pledged in his letter, assuring them they would receive it upon arriving in Shamokin. Yet the Indians warned him that if they reached the white settlement, he would likely refuse to pay, leaving them without recourse. Understanding their apprehension, he proposed to serve as a hostage while sending his wife into town to arrange for the payment. He assured them that if the money wasn't provided, they could do with him as they pleased. This proposal lightened the mood, and the Indians agreed to bring my mother to safety. Once they arrived, my father honored his promise, and the payment was made. Before leaving Shamokin, my father asked an Indian who had been an adopted brother to my mother to visit him whenever he came among the white people. Some time later, the Indian did indeed pay a visit, finding my father living about 10 miles from Chambersburg. After staying for a while, the Indian went to McCormick's Tavern, where he became somewhat intoxicated. During this time, a man named Nugent, later executed in Carlisle for horse theft, attacked him with a large knife, aiming to cut his throat. However, he partially missed, only wounding the Indian's windpipe. Nugent then fled to avoid justice, and it was noted that he spiraled further into vice until his eventual death. A physician was summoned to treat the Indian's wound, which was stitched up, and he remained with my father until he fully recovered. Unfortunately, upon returning to his people, the Indians executed him, accusing him of having sided with the white settlers. In August 1764, driven by fear of the Indians, my family moved to my grandfather Thomas Poe's place, located about 3 miles from their home. While there, my father took a black girl with him to gather hay. As he worked, their dogs suddenly began barking and darting toward a thicket of bushes, raising alarms. Recognizing the potential danger, my father grabbed his gun and instructed the girl to run to the house, suspecting that Indians were nearby. They barely made it inside when, from the loft, they spotted a party led by Captain Potter, who later became General Potter, pursuing a group of Indians responsible for the morning's brutal attack. That day, the Indians had murdered a schoolmaster named Brown and 10 small children, leaving Archibald McAuliffe gravely wounded yet alive. It was striking that, with only a few exceptions, the students were particularly reluctant to attend school that morning. According to Archibald McAuliffe's account, when the master and scholars arrived at the school, 2 students reported having seen Indians on their way. However, the master dismissed their concerns, ordering them to focus on their studies. Shortly thereafter, 2 elderly Indians and a boy rushed to the door. The master, upon seeing them, pleaded for his life, begging them to spare the children. Unfeelingly, the 2 old Indians stood at the entrance while the boy entered the house, armed with a wooden weapon, resembling an Indian maul. In a tragic turn of events, he mercilessly struck down the master and the scholars, subsequently scalping them all. This horrifying incident marks a somber chapter in the history of our frontier schools. This concludes our account from Incidents of Border Life by Joseph Pritz. I hope to uncover a more detailed narrative of the schoolhouse massacre mentioned at the end of this story, though it may be the only account that exists. We've also produced a couple of videos detailing another schoolhouse massacre perpetrated by the Comanches in Hamilton, Texas, in 1867. You can find links to both videos in the description below. The Bard family, also known as Baird or Beard, has a rich history, documented in a 1908 book by Geo Sailhamer titled The Bard Family, which is freely available online for those interested in learning more. Mrs. Bard was named Catherine Poe Bard, and she and Richard Bard had been married since December 1756, with only one child, John Bard, at the time of their capture in 1758. Tragically, John was the innocent child mercilessly killed by the Indians in this narrative. Following their captivity, Richard and Catherine had about 10 more children. Richard's brother, William Bard, founded Bardstown, Kentucky, contributing to the family's legacy. Their father hailed from Antrim in Northern Ireland, and the family was of Scots-Irish descent. I will now read a few passages from the Bard family, which recount events that unfolded after the Bards returned home. Captain White Eyes, a leader of the Turtle tribe of the Delawares, emerged as a steadfast ally of the Americans during the early years of the Revolution. His friendly stance was met with opposition from his rival, Captain Pipe of the Wolf tribe, who was eager to engage in conflict on the western frontier of Pennsylvania. However, White Eyes successfully countered Pipe's ambitions until 1778, when he joined General McIntosh's army to Tuscarora, where he succumbed to smallpox. Following his death, Captain Pipe's influence grew dominant among the Delawares, except among the Moravian Indians, who held to their own principles. Upon Captain White Eyes' death, Captain Pipe claimed that the Great Spirit had removed White Eyes from their path to save his nation. Ironically, the opposite proved true. After years of fierce and often successful warfare against the settlers, the Delawares faced near annihilation at the hands of Mad Anthony Wayne. The remnants of their tribe later participated in the defeat of the Prophet at Tippecanoe under General Harrison. In 1818, the Delawares ceded all their lands in Indiana to the United States and migrated west of the Mississippi River. Eventually, they became incorporated into the Cherokee Nation in Texas and the surrounding Indian Territory. Notably, in 1903, a great-grandson of White Eyes joined a delegation of Delawares in Washington, seeking compensation for infringements on their rights concerning Cherokee lands. This delegation gained the friendly support of Senator Bard of California, a great-grandson of Richard Bard. An interesting relic from Mrs. Bard's captivity still exists. A large horn spoon crafted by one of her Indian brothers, which she used during her time with the Delawares. Upon Mrs. Bard's death, the spoon passed to her youngest daughter, Martha, and from Martha to her daughter, Catherine Wilson, and then to Rachel McMean. This treasured heirloom is now in the possession of Miss McMean, who resides in Blue Ash, Ohio. The spoon, made of black horn, features an intricately carved handle at the top. During the Revolutionary War, Mr. Bard served in Captain Joseph Culbertson's marching company, called up on July 28, 1777 for a campaign around Philadelphia. He later served in Captain Walter McKinney's ranging company on the western frontier. Culbertson's company was part of Colonel Arthur Buchanan's battalion in the 5th class of the Cumberland County Militia. However, specific details of Mr. Bard's service on the frontier remain elusive. His enrollment was also with Captain William Smith's company. Richard Bard never held any political office except for Justice of the Peace for Peters Township, at a time when justices served as judges of the county courts. His commission was dated March 15, 1786. Notably, he was a member of the Pennsylvania Convention of 1787, which reviewed the Constitution framed by the Federal Convention. An anti-federalist, he refused to sign the ratification and later served as a delegate at the Harrisburg Convention of 1788, opposing the federal Constitution. His colleague in the 1787 convention was Colonel John Allison, a staunch Federalist who seconded the motion to ratify made by Thomas McKean. Richard Bard's opposition to the federal Constitution had a detrimental impact on his political fortunes. He faced fierce criticism in the Franklin Repository, the local Federalist publication, for the next decade. Like many early settlers on the Pennsylvania frontier, he acquired extensive tracts of land soon after the conclusion of the French and Indian War, extending as far west as the Alleghenies. The Bard family in Bardstown, Kentucky, has a tradition that during the Revolutionary period, Richard and his brother William traveled to Danville, where Richard built a cabin that entitled him to 1,000 acres. However, he eventually returned to Pennsylvania. Mr. Bard died intestate and was buried in the Presbyterian graveyard at Church Hill. This concludes our episode on the challenges faced by the Bard family during the French and Indian War and throughout the Revolutionary period. We will continue to explore more incidents of border life from this era on our channel. Our channel, focuses on actual historical events often overlooked by mainstream history channels. Here, we strive to keep this significant history alive by sharing the stories of individuals who endured difficult lives long ago, lives whose struggles remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. If you'd like to support our efforts to preserve this vital history, consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a member of our YouTube channel. Your $5 monthly pledge grants you access to exclusive members-only videos, and you will be recognized at the end of each episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.